Awesome. All right. Okay. So let's get started. So thanks everyone for joining. I'm seeing participants kind of stabilize a little bit. So yeah, let's get started. All right. So today's agenda is going to start off with speaker introductions from Odin Mortgage. We've got Rich Harvey here from Propertybuyer and John from Connole Carlisle. We'll go over the Australian mortgages for expats and overseas residents. Then we hit the Australian property market update, then we'll move on to financial and tax considerations, followed by a Q&A. All right, so a little bit about the speakers. So I'm obviously from Odin Mortgage, been an expat mortgage broker for about 2-3 years, but our company has also been in this industry for over 6 years. Maybe I'll pass over to Rich to give a little introduction on himself, and then John can also give one on himself.
Sure. Thanks, Martin. Pleasure to be with everybody today. Rich Harvey, I'm the CEO and founder of Propertybuyer.com. We do exclusive buyers agency work, been in Australia for 21 years. And yeah, looking forward to, I'll cover more in my presentation about the property market. But over to you, John.
Thanks, Rich. I'm John Murphy. I'm the principal consultant of Connole Carlisle Chartered Accountants. I've been in practice for 30 years. We have our home office here in Mackay in Queensland and a visited office that I'm established in Singapore about 5 years ago, and I now specialise in expat tax work. So
great.
Back to you, Martin.
Yeah, good to finally share the stage with you guys again. The last time we did this was probably, I think, 6 months ago, right?
That's right. I think so. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, a lot has changed. So let's get started. So the first section I'll go over would be the Australian lending overview. So a bit of a history lesson for those who have not listened to our presentations before. So preparing for rate hikes and uncertainty. So in 2015, it was actually quite easy for expats to get mortgages while they were overseas. There was probably no need for overseas residents or expat mortgage brokers because you could just rock up to a branch or apply online and you could get a mortgage with 2 or 3 pay slips. But then the market overheated a little with all the foreign buyers coming in from China or overseas and Asia. It tipped the market into kind of a bubble territory, which led the banks and the regulators to come in and kind of start implementing policies that were a little bit more stringent for foreigners and expat residents. So the majors actually left overseas lending and made it quite hard for expats and overseas residents to get loans. The policies were constantly changing up until 2018, where the policies started to stabilize. And from 2018 onwards, you really needed to understand the different policies between the different banks to get your loan approved. Now, fast forward to today in 2022, the talk is mainly about increasing interest rates, right? So how do you manage increasing interest rates coupled with global economic uncertainty? We're seeing a lot of our expats try to get ahead of these raising interest rates and get their living conditions sorted. So that's kind of the backdrop for my presentation today. So how have rates changed from a mortgage perspective? Well, 6 months ago in November 2021, the fixed rates were around 2 to 3% for investment loans. So if you're an expat, you're probably only able to get an investment loan. The rates were around 2 to 3%. And that's what we were recommending the majority of our clients to go towards because we thought that it was the better decision to be fixing your loans 6 months ago. And it turns out that was the correct decision because they had since then been increasing fixed rates about once per month for the past 6 months. So now the investment fixed rates are somewhere between 4 to 5%. And today we're actually recommending our clients go towards the investment variable rate, which is around 2 to 3%. So that's our recommendation at the moment in terms of rates. So the question that I'm getting a lot these days is, should we wait for rates to stabilize? I think the answer kind of depends on your situation, but from 2010 to 2021, when rates were going down, the textbook answer was that prices would go up, right? So rates come down, your prices go up. The action to take was probably to try to get into the market. And if you had gotten into the market during that period, you would probably have seen your property prices go up probably 10% on average the past decade. Fast forward to today, the rates are expected to be going up. This is pretty much a known fact. The textbook answer says prices are going to go down, but I'm actually not so sure about that because in history and in the past, just because rates have gone up, prices didn't necessarily go down. So it's actually a bit of a question mark on that one. So what's the action to take? If you're a pure investor, I think that the action to take is probably to proceed with caution. Maybe consider having a look at what's happening in the market and reevaluating whether or not you can find any undervalued properties with the help of some buyer's agents like Rich, who are very experienced. Whereas if you're purchasing a family home, it could be a good opportunity for you to get ahead of the rate hikes. And what do I mean by that? So talking about the pure investor piece first, if you're an investor, you're probably more interested in your investment returns, which are dependent on your purchase price, right? So there's always going to be gems in the market. If you can locate these and find these, it could still be a great investment. But because it's an investment, it's very dependent on your holding cost, what price you can get in at. So be also prepared for a scenario where the prices do not drop, okay? But your holding costs go up because your mortgage rates have gone up and your leverage comes down. So your overall return on your capital could actually be potentially less. So that's why you should wait and see or potentially take a more cautious approach if you're an investor, or rely on experts to help you kind of find these undervalued gems. Whereas if you're purchasing a future home, it's probably less about the price and more about the utility or the future standard of living. So whether or not you want a good neighborhood, what kind of lifestyle you want, do you want that home now with a barbecue, with a pool and a backyard? If these are the considerations that you want, you might want to consider getting ahead of the rate hikes. And what do I mean by that? Well, as of today, the assessment rates are still relatively low, about 2% on top of the cash rate for mortgages. So that means for a $1.2 million purchase, you may be able to borrow about $900K. For that same couple or individual, when rates are high at the 4 to 5% rate in about, let's say, 12 to 24 months, you would probably only be able to borrow $600K for a $900K purchase, which ultimately means you need more equity, right? So yes, prices may or may not come down, but what I can tell you from an expat perspective and purchasing is when rates are high, you can actually borrow a lot less. So you may not get that dream home or that family home that you wanted to buy in 12 to 24 months from now, just because you think prices have come off 10%, because your borrowing power probably comes off significantly more than that when rates go up. So what is still possible? 70% borrowing is still possible. 80% is actually a little bit harder now because banks have been told to scale back the LVR that they are allowed to lend out. And 90% LVR, only one bank will do this at the moment. 30-year loan terms are still possible with the right lender. Interest-only options are still available, but they're slightly more expensive, about 30 to 50 basis points more expensive. Again, they're trying to target these investors. Cashing out from existing properties, that's also available. And self-managed, self-employed mortgages are also 100% possible from non-bank lenders. So that's kind of the mortgage lending overview at the moment. The next section is, why should you use an expat mortgage broker? Well, a lot of people also ask me this question, which is, can't they do the financing themselves? Well, the answer is, yeah, you could do the financing yourself. You'll have to research 30 banks yourself, manage the agents and solicitors yourself, fill out the application yourself, execute and do the contracts yourself, right? And then in the end, you're most likely going to get rejected and pull your own hair out yourself, right? Or you can come to Odin Mortgage, right? We will do the preliminary assessment for you before we submit any documents. We'll guide you through the process. We'll manage all the parties, and we do this all for free, right? So for those of you who do like to pull your own hair out, I'll give you 3 tips, right? Number 1, research which banks will apply Australian tax rates versus local tax rates. If you're going to go to a bank that applies Australian tax rates on your Hong Kong, Singapore, or Middle East income, that's just going to be terrible for your borrowing power, especially given that the effective tax rates in the Middle East are effectively 0, right? So research which banks will apply Australian versus local tax rates. Tip number 2, research which banks will lend 80% LVR and which banks will only do 70% for expats. And tip number 3, you have to research policies relevant to your situation. For example, some banks will not allow you to cash out and do a refinance, which means you can't tap into equity from your existing properties. Some banks will only let you use bonuses if you're working for a global multinational company. And some banks have all these other requirements depending on your current situation. So if you go to the wrong bank, your borrowing power is probably only going to be 30 to 40% of what it could be if you went to an expat-friendly bank. So let's go through an example or a case study of what the wrong expat bank would look like for someone in the Middle East, right? So someone in the Middle East, their effective tax rate is pretty much 0%. But if you went to the wrong expat bank, this is how they would assess your income. So you make 50K per month, and they apply a 20% foreign discount on your income. So immediately your 50K gets shaved down to 40K. They apply Australian tax rates of about 30K, and your effective net income becomes 28K. They then shave off 15K for your rental income, rental expense per month. So you're left with 13K. And then they take away 9K dirhams for living expenses. So essentially, you're left with a borrowing power of about 250K. However, if you went to an expat-friendly bank, this is how they would assess your income. They don't apply a foreign income discount, so your 50K remains 50K. You're in a low tax or a no tax environment, so your 50K again stays the same. Your rent expense and your living expense is the same for both banks because this is realistically what you're paying. So your borrowing power is actually about $1.2 million just by going to the correct bank. So if you're an expat, you really need to be going to the correct bank. And that's why so many of our expats, they go to the big four, ANZ, CBA, Westpac, NAB, and they're on good income, but they cannot borrow anywhere near what they thought they would be able to. And it's because of those reasons that I gave earlier. So yeah, different policies can mean a 2 to 4 times difference in borrowing power. So the other topic that a lot of people ask me about and talk about these days is to buy now or buy when we get back, right? So the common question is, we're looking to move back to Australia within the next 6 to 18 months. Is it better to buy now or buy a property when we get back? Well, the answer is it depends, right? As with all things in life, there are pros and cons. I'll go through each of these in detail, but the pros are you're able to maximize borrowing for your dream home. It's actually a more efficient mortgage application, and there's reduced relocation logistics from doing things as an expat. The cons are you're going to have reduced income and higher repayments when you go back to Australia. You cannot immediately claim grants, and you have to commit before you settle down in Australia. So let's go through the first pro. Expat incomes are able to maximize borrowing for their dream home, right? So as an expat, generally you have slightly higher income, maybe 10 to 20% if you're in the finance or legal industries or any other relevant industries as an expat in Middle East or US or New York and UK, places like this. You will have 2 years of bonus history because you've been working overseas for a while. You have low or no income tax in places like the UAE or Hong Kong or Singapore, and you can claim rental income from the investment property. So your borrowing power is actually quite higher as an expat. Whereas if you're in Australia, the lower income and the higher tax rates is going to be a negative towards your borrowing power. And then you're going to have to start thinking about your HEX loans that you've been running away from for the past 5 years. You start to have Medicare levy and also superannuation also coming into the picture as well. So all of those factors before will reduce your borrowing power if you were to go back to Australia first. The second pro is that the mortgage application is a little bit more efficient because banks prefer stability. So you'll need 3 months of pay slips. You have those if you're working currently while you're overseas, but if you move back to Australia, you'll need to wait 3 months, right? you won't be able to use your bonus because in this new job, the banks won't like the volatility or the change in your working circumstances. So they want to use 2 years. They want to see 2 years of steady bonus. Stability in the role, so you don't have an issue with that in your current role, but you will when you move back to Australia. HECS, Medicare, Super, Tax, mentioned that before, that will reduce your borrowing power. The only positive is probably that you'll be able to get a cheaper owner-occupier loan when you're in Australia, whereas when you're overseas, you'll need to get an investment mortgage, but that can be flipped over when you move back to Australia by updating some of your details. The third pro is reduced relocation logistics and headaches. So why are there headaches, right? How long do you want to be in? The questions to answer are, how long do you want to be in accommodation limbo, right? Do you want to move once into your home, or do you want to move twice into a hotel or an Airbnb, or move in with the parents while you're waiting for payslips and stability in the role? I had a client who decided not to purchase while they're an expat. When they moved back to Australia, they ended up having to move 3 times before they found the property that they actually wanted to live in. They got kicked out of their rental property. They couldn't find the property that they wanted. So it was actually just quite chaotic. And if you have kids as well, how convenient is that for getting to work or school for the kids? Do they have to learn how to catch a new bus? You have to drive and learn new routes. Those are considerations. Another consideration is, will you like your new job or the new role? If you don't and you change jobs, you'll be in limbo for another 3 months. So you have to wait for another set of 3 pay slips. And then finally, the last question is probably, are you comfortable buying the property without physically seeing it, right? So rely on your friends and family, or consider using a buyer's agent to inspect the property for you. So that's the final pro. What are the cons, right? So the cons are, you'll have reduced income after you move back to Australia, but higher repayments, right? You can borrow more, but the question is always, should you borrow more, especially in this rising rate environment? Make sure you understand how much you can repay when you move back to Australia in your new job. And to do that, you can actually check out the repayment calculators on the internet, or use our one on our website. The second con is you cannot immediately claim grants, right? So stamp duty rebates, generally they vary on the state, and it's less relevant for anything above 600 to 700K. First homeowner grants, again, you cannot claim these as an expat and if you're buying an investment property, but these can be claimed again in the future. The key takeaway, though, is that the grants are not relevant for expats. So this is something you have to forego in the short term. The final con is you need to commit before settling down in Australia. So the risk is you buy something you have not physically seen, right? So what are the mitigants? Start the process early and do not FOMO into the purchase. Buy in areas you're familiar with and understand. Leverage on friends and family. And then utilize experts or buyer's agents to do some due diligence for you. All right, so that's the end of my mortgage section. So I'll just conclude with maybe 4 more tips before I pass over to Rich to talk about the property section. So the first one is use an expat mortgage broker if you're based overseas, because you really need to understand the policies. Number 2, get a pre-approval to avoid any headaches that you might have. Number 3, leverage on your expat status and earning power to consider getting ahead of the rate hikes. And the final tip is review your existing mortgages and properties for cost savings and potential cash out potential. Yeah, so that concludes the mortgage section. I'll pass over to Rich and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Martin. That was brilliant. There's some really good takeaways there. Yeah, I got a lot out of that myself. So fantastic. Well done. I'll just share my screen now with everybody. Bring it up. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Rich Harvey is my name. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the property market and where it's up to. So a little bit further about myself. As I mentioned before, I've been 21 years in the business. About time for a birthday cake, I think, and celebrate. I've served as the president of the Buyers Agent Association of Australia, and I'm a qualified property investment advisor as well. So the things I want to talk about today is the impact of interest rates on the market. What is it? You know, what's the actual impact? Because it's the top of mind. Ask the question, is now a good time to buy or invest? Talk about the headwinds and tailwinds for our property market, and then get into some case studies. Now, I've got a lot of slides. Now, I'm not going to go through every slide, but also I just want to encourage you too, if you've got a question that you'd like answered, just go to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, type it in as each of us is speaking, and we're going to have a 10 to 15 minute window at the end to answer all of your questions. And we do encourage you to partake of that, because that's often the most valuable part of these webinars. Okay, so interest rates. We know the Reserve Bank jacked it up 0.5% this month. A lot of people freaked out, thinking it was only going to be 0.25. But look, we know that rates are going to get back to their what they call neutral rate, probably around 2%, 2.5%, depending on how hard the RBA wants to go on controlling inflation and how big a problem they consider inflation to actually be. There was a good article the other day that sort of, is inflation really a bad problem? Well, if we look back, I think, Martin, you alluded to this in your presentation, we can have times where there's rising interest rates and rising property prices. Now, I don't think it's going to happen currently in this next 6 to 12 months, but back in the early 2000s, borrowers were paying 8 and 9% on their mortgages, and we saw 22 rate rises over that period of time, but property prices also doubled over that period of time. So you can have periods where there's interest rate rises and property rate rises, and we'll get into the reasons for that later. Another question I get is, how long is this downturn going to last? You know, we've hit the peak of the market. We're now in a correctional phase. How many months or years are we going to be in this sort of peak to trough period? So I rang my mate, Tim Lawless at CoreLogic the other day. I said, Tim, can you give me some really nice charts? I'm doing a webinar to these expats. I'm sure they want to know the data, right? So this is what he gave me. And if you look at all of the periods of time back in the late 80s and 90s and the 2000s, you'll see the average time over the last 40 years was 8.4 months. And then once you've hit the bottom of the cycle, back up to where it was, can take between 9 months to 3 years. So I think, you know, we've had a pretty massive boom, and I think it'll probably take about 2 years to get back to recovery. But the crystal ball thing that nobody can tell you is exactly what month we're going to be at the bottom. Will it be September 2022? Will it be January 23? I don't know. And I don't pretend to know. But what I do know is that I'm buying properties myself right now in a declining market, because I find it's one of the best times to buy. Okay, so we've had a massive uplift in value in the property market. We're almost at $10 trillion of value. You know, when I used to do these slides a couple of years ago, we were just nudging 7 trillion. Now we're almost at 10 trillion. So residential property absolutely underpins Australia's wealth. And most Australians have enjoyed a significant uplift and have that, what we call the wealth effect, and should be feeling a bit wealthier. And if we look at during the period of when COVID hit, national dwelling values are up about 155,000 since March 2020. So we've all got a few bit of equity sitting around, and if we're not using that equity, it's called lazy equity, and you can leverage it safely. I've got a bunch of stats here. I'm not going to go into too much detail, except to say we know the trend of where the market's at. The other thing to point out is that with CoreLogic data, it is, you know, it's historical and it's often quite out of date. So this is the latest stat, which only goes back to April when you look at the quarterly changes. And it's saying that Sydney's corrected 0.5%. Well, in actual fact, Sydney in most suburbs has corrected anywhere from 5% to around 10%. So on the ground, the actual factors have declined a lot more. And this is also a point for the upside, right? Once we hit that bottom of the trough of the cycle, we're going to see some headlines. But again, they'll be out of date. But we are in a period of correction. If we look at over the last 12 months, obviously all the capitals, even despite the correction over a 12-month period, we're still in positive territory. But you can see here, we're coming off our very significant peaks and trending back downward to negative territory. There's the quarterly change in capital cities. We are still seeing growth in the Sydney, Adelaide and Perth markets. Brisbane is the market that we really like, and we think it's got a lot of legs left in its, a lot of petrol left in its tank. In terms of sales volumes, the actual number of transactions has been trending down. A lot of vendors are keeping their powder dry and not selling unless they have to. And I'll show you another chart that correlates with that on listing volumes in a minute as well. Auction clearance rates have been trending down as well. Last weekend, we're at 59%, and that's indicative of the market. So in the mid 50s, low 60% is where you typically see a correcting market. If it gets to 40, that's panic stations, you know, but I don't think we'll quite get that low. I'll miss that one. Days on market, we got down to like around 24 days, I think, at the peak of the market, and you'll start to see the days on market start to climb back up to around this 45-day number for the main capital cities. So that's been typically an average, but we're still at, you know, around 31 days at the moment. Vendor discounting as well. So that's the rate or the number or the discount factor applied to a listing. So once it goes on market, how much is it discounted by? It's been pretty low. Vendor discounting is typically around 4 to 5%, but obviously the last couple of years it's been around 3% because prices have been holding pretty well. Listing volumes. Now this is the two charts I want to show you. This is new listing volumes coming to the market. This dark blue line here is actually showing where new listings. So we've had a good uptick in the number of new listings compared to the averages of the last 5 years. But on the next slide, total listings is still around about 30% below the 5-year average. So even though you go, oh, it's a buyer's market, there's actually still not as much out there to find as you would like. And that's an interesting factor. A difficult one to explain. I think partly explained because people are reluctant to sell in a declining market. It's also because vendors, I think, are holding their properties for a much longer period of time. So that's also reducing the stock on market. Rental rates are literally going through the roof. I've just increased my own rentals on all of my properties quite significantly, anywhere from 5 to 15%. Just had one property I was getting $620 a week on, and I've now jacked it up to $750. So make sure you're talking to your property manager if you've got an investment property and ask them to give you a market rent review. And that's going to be a common theme over the next 2 years. As interest rates rise, you are definitely going to see rental and yields rise as well. And dwelling approvals, we saw quite a sharp drop of around 18% through March, and also for units as well. So I think we're going to start to see building approvals for both houses and units trending down for a couple of reasons. The market's more volatile, but particularly construction costs are very, very high. And the investors are coming back. We look at the total volume of loans that's out there for investors. This purple line here is showing that uptick in investor activity. So they obviously were attracted by capital gains, and I think as we go forward, they'll be attracted by higher rental yields. So just addressing this question, everyone, about is it a good time to buy? I always take the long-term historical view, and this chart, it needs to be updated for the last couple of years, but I like looking back to the 60s. And if you look at all the circles here of the periods of time where we've had a decline in the market compared to where we've had an increase in the market, you can see the downturns have been far less severe than the upturns. So, you know, the average of a 5 to maximum 10% correction in the market. Now, look, we may get a 15% correction in the market, but that's off the back of having a 38 or a 35% increase in some capital city prices. So is it a good time to invest? Well, in my view, yes, because there's always an opportunity whether the market's up, down or sideways. It depends on what price you end up paying in today's market, and you can future-proof your purchasing by paying the right price. As I said, there's some markets that are still growing and there's very high demand. We're starting to see listing volumes increase a little bit more. Rental price, I mentioned, going up, but a softening market means a more opportunity for the astute buyer. And I think, Martin, you pointed this out quite nicely in one of your slides, which correlates to mine. I tried to do it graphically here by a seesaw, right? We've got this issue of declining borrowing capacity and prices correcting. So the dilemma is that if you wait too long and go, you know, I'm going to wait 6 months or I'm going to wait 9 months until I see the market correct, the interest rates being jacked up might actually see your borrowing capacity crimped at a faster rate than what prices are declining. And prices might actually stabilize, and then you've missed the market again completely. So that's just something to consider about your timing coming into the market. I wrote down the other day, I'm an economist by training. I said to my team, I'm going to write down all the headwinds that I see out there for property buyers at the moment, and also look at the tailwinds or things supporting the property market. So these are the main 5 that I came up with for headwinds. Obviously, rising interest rates. Yes, we're going back to more normal rates. It's going to cost more to borrow money, but that's just the price of money. The biggest factor is depressed consumer sentiment. Unfortunately, the property market is very much dependent on where consumers think the market's going to go. And if consumer sentiment is down, then they tend to not do anything, sit on their hands. Cost of petrol, cost of lettuces gone through the roof. There's a lot of talk about the COS lettuce paying $10 or $12 for a lettuce these days because there's no supply. It's crazy. We've all got cost of living pressures, right? And that's hitting the hip pocket nerve quite severely. We talked about borrowing capacity and also share market and global uncertainty. So all of that has a negative effect on people's headspaces and what they want to do with their money. Now let's compare those 5 factors. And I came up with, actually I've got my numbers wrong here. It should be 14 factors here. I've got the numbering wrong, but 14 tailwind factors supporting the market. Number 1, migration. We need to see more migration coming into Australia. The numbers at the moment are about 160,000, but our Home Office, the Department of Home Affairs, have got to get their crap together and start processing visa applications. They're way behind. But there are a large number of people that want to come to Australia, and we need to ramp up migration because we have a massive skill shortage. We're seeing declining building approvals. That's going to put more pressure of low supply. That's going to put more pressure on pricing, because if we've got short supply and high demand, then prices will rise. We've got a pretty resilient economy. I mean, we survived COVID really well thanks to the stimulus packages, but we do have an adaptable and resilient economy. Low vacancy rates, massive rental increases, low unemployment, strong household balance sheets. If you look at all the stats, the banks are saying that 90 to 80% of mortgage holders are ahead on their repayments, and APRA is still insisting on the 3% buffer rate. We're seeing wages growing, construction costs rising. So why is construction costs rising a tailwind? Well, if it costs more to replace your home and rebuild your home, then more people will see the value of their home as a replacement cost stabilise. So what I'm saying is it's going to be also lifts the value of your existing home because it costs more to replace. We've also had announcements by both the federal and the state governments, both announcing a shared equity scheme. And just yesterday, the state government came out with a proposed first home buyer stamp duty reform. So offering home buyers a upfront payment or an annual land tax in lieu of the stamp duty. And lastly, property is always seen as a safe haven. When the share market's going nuts and going down, then people tend to put their property as a hedge against inflation into the property market. I won't go through these, but I'll put these in my notes. These are a couple of key things we look for in selecting properties, and a couple of equity building strategies that we use regularly for our clients in buying properties. These are the 7 steps, a bit like with Martin's presentation. A lot of people will do buying on their own and do well. Others will choose to employ and outsource this activity to a buyer's agent. But whether you use a buyer's agent or do it yourself, these are the steps you need to take. You need to have a clear plan, a clear strategy. You need to have good research that supports that strategy. You then got to get out there and wear out your shoe leather. And obviously, if you're an expat living overseas, you need to employ boots on the ground. There's no point trying to buy it just off an image off realestate.com, because you don't know what's over the back fence. You don't know how close to the roads it is, or whether there's a 5G tower being built next door, or a noisy road. You've got to check out all of these factors. Once you've found the right property, then you've got to evaluate what it is worth in today's market. And you need to do a very clear and concise comparable sales analysis. Look at what's sold in the area and compare we'd like to come up with a number that's relevant to pay today. And we spend around 2 hours on each property appraisal. It does take considerable time to assess the value of a property, whereas most bank values will probably spend around 15-20 minutes having a quick look online at the numbers. We also got to complete due diligence, organise a pest and building report, look at any other surrounding factors on the property. And then we negotiate on your behalf. So we step in and negotiate the lowest price. And having a buying agent or a buyer's advocate between you and the selling agent provides a really good level of protection. Make sure that you don't overpay on the property. And the last step is organising a property manager if you're going to rent it out, or and then a pre-settlement inspection to make sure all the fittings and fixtures are in place, ready for handover on settlement day. So that's the steps you need to go through. Again, if you want to use a buyer's agent, these are some of the key benefits. Just we'll do all of those 7 steps, give you access to more properties, off-market properties, give you independent advice. And we just charge a fixed fee. It's a sliding scale. It's approximately between 1.75 to 2% as an approximate fee, but we'll give you a scale of fees based on each price point. You pay an engagement fee and then a success fee once we've secured the property. But as I said, having someone on your side makes a huge difference to the outcome. Happy to share that with anyone that's interested. So I'll just finish with a couple of case studies before I hand over to John. So I won't go through all of these, but these are just some recent purchases we've done for clients, and we're actually able to get pretty significant discounts at the moment, and we'll get deeper discounts as we go forward. So this was one Matt did at Roseville, just near the station. We appraised it at 4.2. The owner was pretty keen to sell, and we got it off market at just over the 4 million mark. Beautiful family home, beautiful north-facing yard with a pool. Would be a classic family home. Another one we also did, which was a really lovely 4-bedroom home. Walked to the station at Waverton. Got that for 3.2, and again renovated with great views. We also buy in Melbourne. This was one we bought for an investor in the Bayside area down toward Frankston. Amanda Jones, our buyer's agent there, got this one just under the 1 million mark, rents for $700 a week. Another one in Melbourne we bought for another investor, purchased that for $873, pretty close to the asking price as well, but that'll be a great long-term buy and hold, and we'll see significant capital growth in that market. We also do commercial property. Alberto bought this one for one of our clients on the Central Coast. Managed to secure a great property with a 7 + 7 year lease, yielding a net yield of just over 6%. Very rare to find a 7 + 7 lease, but really, really good opportunity for one of our high net worth clients. Brisbane's another market that we're really targeting a lot for investors, getting strong yields, generally over the 5% mark in that area. And this was a great property, 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car home on about 400 square metres of land for $525. I'll flick through a couple of these. Another one in Brisbane, that was for a home buyer. We bought for 1.65. Really, really good saving. And this buyer might even rent it out for a short period of time as well. But really, really good buy there. We can also buy cheaper ones just outside of Brisbane in a place like Toowoomba, around 400K. We can buy houses up there. They're yielding in the mid 5%. There's a couple there. I'll flick through a few more. There's lots and lots of examples. Newcastle's also another market that we love to buy in. Very, very strong rental market there as well. A lot of owner-occupiers have moved up to that area, renting for a period of time and then looking to buy. So we're seeing really strong returns for our investors in that market. I'm going to flick through right to the end. I'll leave all of these examples up we'll actually give you a copy of all of our presentations. So if you do want a copy, it'll be emailed out to you along with a recording of the webinar as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And John, over to you.
All right,
we'll do Q&A.
Thanks, Rich. I'll share my screen. Just give me half a moment. Okay, so Rich and Martin get to talk about the fun stuff and I get to talk about tax. So bear with me. All right, so what we're going to discuss today are a number of points. How does the Australian tax treatment differ between residents and non-residents? Common mistakes that I see in expat tax returns. I'm going to talk about some tax strategies for expat property purchases. Holding property in a company versus individual names. Is it worth doing? And then just discuss the services of our firm, and then we have Q&A. So how does the tax treatment differ between residents and non-residents? Lots of differences. Main ones are starting with the tax rates. So in the left-hand column, now these are the rates for 2021-22, with the year that's just about to finish. You'll see that a resident of Australia for tax purposes does have a tax-free threshold, and then there's 4 different rates after that, whereas non-residents start paying tax from $1 at 32.5 cents. If you get to the bottom row, you can see on $180,000 as a non-resident, you're almost paying $10,000 more than a resident. The CGT general discount ceases. So that relates to where you purchase an asset and hold it for longer than 12 months. As a resident, you get a 50% discount on the amount of capital gains tax. When you become a non-resident, that discount ceases. You continue paying your HECS or HELP debts when you are a non-resident, and it's actually based on your worldwide income. So if you've got $10,000 in net rent in Australia plus $400,000 in income overseas, that's the basis on which you'll pay your HECS debt each year. A big one in the expat community a couple of years ago was the capital gains tax main resident exemption. It's no longer available to non-residents. So even if you purchased a property, genuinely moved in, lived in it for a period of time, move overseas and sell it whilst you're a non-resident, you get absolutely no benefit from the main residence exemption anymore. And just the tax mantra for non-residents and residents. Residents of Australia for tax purposes are liable to tax in Australia on their worldwide income, but non-residents of Australia are only liable to tax in Australia on their Australian-sourced income. There's a whole host of examples I could give there, but the most often seen one is rental income from a property in Australia. Interest from Australian bank, you still have to pay withholding tax on it, and that's based on your country of residence at the time. You still have to pay tax on unfranked dividends, and again, the rate of withholding is based on where you live. Contrary to that, franked dividends or fully franked dividends, such as you get from most of the time from Australian banks and Telstra and what have you, they don't even go in your tax return as a non-resident. Capital gains from the sale of Australian property assets. So notwithstanding, as in Singapore, there's no capital gains tax, but if you purchase a house in Australia, you have to pay capital gains tax on it, or rather, and on any assets that were not deemed disposed of when you left Australia. Classic example there is if you've got a portfolio of shares, you leave Australia and you might have a little capital gain on those particular shares. You pay that tax before you leave. Then when you're overseas and sell them and make as much money as you like, you don't have to pay any tax on it because you've taken them out of the Australian tax system. Something you can never do with Australian property. It's always caught. All right, so this applies, I guess, for people that are already overseas and are lodging income tax returns. I review a lot of income tax returns where people refer clients to me, and there seems to be a common theme with the mistakes. So the first one, and this is in no particular order, but not claiming all available interest deductions. You simply ask the client, oh, don't you have a debt in relation to this particular property or properties? Yes, of course I do. Well, no interest claimed on it. This is one I see almost in every return I review. So not claiming Division 43 capital works allowances. So if you've purchased a property that was built from 1985 or after, you're able to claim 2.5% on the actual cost of construction. The amount of times that I see that in expat tax returns where people aren't claiming that is staggering. Land tax. Now, this is a bit of a silent one. So when you're living in your own home in Australia, you are exempt from land tax. There are a few exceptions, but on the whole, you're exempt from paying land tax. When you move overseas and aren't resident in Australia and you're renting that home out, well, you are subject to land tax depending on the rateable value of your property. A client who lives in Shanghai is the worst case I've seen. They had to pay $170,000 payable to the Victorian Office of State Revenue plus penalties because when they left, they were already in the land tax system with some rental properties that they had. but they didn't tell the OSR that they'd moved out of their home, such that the home then got added into the land tax base from the date that they left. Hence, they had to pay $170K to the Victorian OSR. I often come across returns where people are having their returns prepared on the basis of them being a resident for tax purposes when they're clearly not. And some of the classic ones there, you're an Australian citizen, so you can never be a non-resident. That's patently wrong. You're a New Zealand citizen and have lived in Australia for 20 years, but you can never be an Australian tax resident. That's wrong. You own a house in Australia, so you can never be a non-resident. Again, wrong. So yeah, your residency status is fact and degree. So just the fact that you merely are a citizen or own property here, that doesn't of itself mean that you can never be a non-resident. I often see initial repairs not being deductible. So an initial repair is a concept where if you've purchased a rental property or it's your main residence and you change it into a rental property, you undertake repairs of some significance soon into the rental arrangement. So a return I recently reviewed, the previous accountant claimed a roof replacement of $25K and a full repaint of $19K as being deductible prior to the rental even commencing. Now, in this particular case, even if you'd done the re-roof and the repaint at pretty much any time after the tenant had moved in there, it's never going to be deductible because the condition that the roof was in and the walls inside and out were in were pretty poor at the time of creation of the rental arrangement. Now, if you had a rental property that the roof was fine and then 7-8 years later you needed to do a re-roof, well, that's quite okay. If the paint was fine and then you had to, let's say you had a really, really bad tenant who heavily scraped the walls, well, that's quite okay as well. I often see interest and dividends being placed in as taxable income. They're not, so you only have to pay withholding tax on that, not the 32.5% rate. Often see Medicare levy being payable. Non-residents don't pay Medicare levy. Now, just one thing to add, which really isn't in the tax arena, but I find a lot of people don't know. When you're a non-resident, you can continue to access your Medicare benefits for up to 5 years post non-residency. So just a little tip for those of you that are outside Australia and think that you can't access that. Well, you can, as long as it's not been more than 5 years since you left the country. I'm often getting clients to go back, or new clients go back and get a departure valuation of their main residence. Under certain circumstances, you can use that valuation as your cost base for future capital gains tax calculations. All right, so let's just talk about a couple of tax strategies for expat property purchases. So the key thing for me from a tax perspective, Rich can help you obviously with determining the right property, but mine is making sure that you buy it in the right entity. Now, when I say entity, I mean person, company, trust. And I guess the considerations include whether you're going to occupy it as a main residence at some later stage and what your Australian sourced income is going to be whilst both an expat and an Australian tax resident. Sorry, I don't know why that's doing that. Okay, so if you get the entity wrong, if you then have to transfer the property, let's just say for whatever reason, the property is purchased in individual names of partner A and partner B, and then it's determined that, oh, gee, partner B would probably be the better purchaser. You repay your stamp duty, you repay your legal fees, you repay your bank. And if the property's gone up in value, you've got capital gains tax costs. So it's absolutely vital to get it in the right entity to start off with. Okay, so one question I'm often asked is about whether or not if I purchase a property in the name of a company or in a trust or indeed in a super fund, will I be able to live in the property and attract the main residence exemption? No, you will not. So purchases of properties in non-individual names will never attract a partial main residence exemption. When I say partial, I'm assuming that you're purchasing this property as a rental property, and it doesn't trigger the main residence exemption immediately, but you would when you move back into the property. Is the property eligible for capital works deductions? So why do I say that? Well, you get an extra deduction for, as I mentioned earlier, 2.5% of the cost of construction of the property where it was bought from, rather when it was built from 1985 and after. You can also get that on, you might have had a house built in 1990 that in 2014 was extensively renovated. Well, those costs get added in too. Ask the vendor, if it is eligible, ask the vendor, does he or she have a tax depreciation report? If so, ask them to provide it to you at settlement. And land tax. So that's one that people sometimes don't consider. They've purchased a property, then out of the blue, they get this thing in the mail from their state office of state revenue saying, oh, thank you, you now owe us $14,000 in land tax. So is it subject to state-based land tax? Now, every state and territory has their own land tax regime. And I expect other states to follow suit. Queensland has recently introduced changes to calculate land tax liabilities based on your Australian property holdings, not just the Queensland holdings. So that's a bit greedy for mine, but expect if Queensland's done it for other states to follow. All right, holding property in a company versus individual names. Is it worth it? I don't reach a conclusion here. It's all horses for courses. The most usual reason I see people holding property in a company is for asset protection purposes. As an example, one of my partners has a client who's a paramedic, and he is quite an astute property investor. He's got a significant number of properties, all of them in different company names. He's terrified that in his role, he's going to get sued one day by somebody. So that's what he's chosen to do. So to run through some points to consider if you're looking at purchasing a property in the company, as I said earlier, a property purchased in a company or a trust can never attract a full or partial main residence exemption as it can in individual names. Importantly, negative gearing losses. Now, any losses that you incur in a company get carried forward until they're used up by positive rental, other income, or capital gains. In comparison, negative gearing losses from properties held in individual names are immediately available to offset other taxable income. Let's use an example. You've got a main residence property in Sydney. You've moved over to Hong Kong or Singapore. Its net rent might be $70,000 or $80,000 a year. You purchase another property, you can then use the losses from that other property to offset the income that you earn in the first property. Now, you might have other interest income and what have you that you can use to offset, but in a company situation, if you only have the one property in there and there's no other means of income, you get no immediate tax benefit. Income in a company is taxed at the company rate from $1, whereas income in individual names is taxed at individual, resident or non-resident rates. But as I mentioned earlier, non-residents don't receive a tax-free threshold. So companies are pretty much treated the same as individuals. Now, the next point I could talk for the next hour on, but won't. But suffice it to say, if you make a big capital gain in a company and then decide that you're going to use that money to, I don't know, buy a holiday home on the Gold Coast or do something like that, taking the money out of the company and having it used by individuals can be very costly. And also, if you're living overseas and looking at establishing a company to purchase a property or really do anything, you'll need somebody, friend, relative, to put their hand up as a director on the basis that they are ordinarily resident in Australia, but you aren't. All right, so what do? We provide accounting and tax services to Aussie expats, Singapore and elsewhere, and particularly in the provision of bespoke advice and in the provision of the preparation of individual income tax returns. We do all the typical accounting work, but a lot of that doesn't really apply to the expat world, but we're a full service firm. Then this is how you get in touch with each of us. And Rich, I assume you'll be doing the Q&A like usual.
No problem. Wonderful. Thank you, John. Wonderful. Full of knowledge. It's wonderful. Excellent. Well, look, we'll leave that slide there. That's great. Let's just jump into the Q&A. And if you've got, let's see, there's a bunch of Q&As in both the chat and the Q&A. If you can just go from here, just chuck it in the Q&A. Let's get straight into it.
So quickly, just with this recording, I think it makes more sense to stop sharing the screen, John, because the recording actually looks a little bit better without the screen. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Martin. Oh, now I've just got to find my Q&A where it's gone. Hang on, it'll come back. There it is. So, sorry, questions. There was one here I had, scroll from the top. Question from Francesca. Question, if buying either an expat property or investment property, will you firstly need to live in the property to reduce the highest tax threshold? John?
The answer to that is sort of yes, in as much as if you want to establish the property as your main residence, you have to genuinely move into it at the immediately upon purchase, and do so on the basis that you are genuinely living there for a period of time. You can't really dress it up. You have to live in there. What that then does, if you leave the property, rent it out, you've got a 6-year absence window that if you don't acquire another main residence property within that 6 years, you can still sell the property capital gains tax free. But if you, use an example, move to Sydney, purchase the property, move in, 2 years later, you take on a role in the US, and whilst you're over there, decide to sell it, none of the main residence benefits apply. There is zero. You are treated as if you didn't move into it at the start.
Great. Thanks, John. Ron's asking me, do we have auction clearance data for Perth? Unfortunately, I don't, Ron. Normally, I get access to all the data, but Perth's just not available at the moment. Joanne is asking, does a decline in building approvals support rising prices in the existing market? So a decline in building approvals simply means there'll be less supply coming on the market. So if building approvals were going through the roof and they were all being completed, you would see property prices start to dilute. But the problem is building approvals are going down, and even if they're approved, they're not actually getting built as quickly as they should be, simply because construction costs are higher and developers are finding their feasibilities. It's just not as profitable. So I think you'll find that as building approvals decline, it actually puts a floor under property prices. Dave Hall, great to see you online, Dave. Thank you for your comment on there. Kat is asking, can you share the slides? Yes, that's all good. Hang on, there's another one here. Another question. This is a John question. If I claim the capital works allowances, Division 43, say at 2.5%, doesn't it mean that when you sell, you have a bigger capital gain because you have reduced the cost base of the property?
Yes, but you effectively get the income tax benefit in advance along the way. So you're getting the sugar hit now, and at some stage later, if you sell the property, yes, it does get added back.
Great. Is land tax a tax deductible expense, John?
Yes.
Simple as that. Absolutely. Yeah. Another question from Travis. If the property is eligible for capital works deductions and you have no schedule previously nor knowledge of what can be deducted, can you make assumptions and create your own schedule?
Back in the good old days, 30 years ago, when I was a young accountant, that's what we used to do. The ATO changed their view on that probably 15 to 20 years ago, and they won't allow you to do that. You can at your own peril, but you'll be required to get a tax depreciation schedule from either a valuer or a quantity surveyor if you get audited.
It only costs $600 to get done. So and that's a tax deductible expense. And a lot of the US providers I know say that unless we can't get more deduction than the cost, we'll give it to you for free anyway. So yeah. A couple of Q&As. Dimitri's asking, can you sell me the beachfront villa in those slides? Well, Dimitri, we don't sell, but we can definitely help you buy a beautiful villa on the beach. So love to chat with you afterwards. Andrew is asking, Rich, you said you were buying now. Where and what are you buying? Oh, from Annette. Great question. Look, yes, I'm happy to share. I've just bought a property in Brisbane where I'm looking to do a renovation on that property and increase the rental return. And I've also bought one on the Central Coast where I'm adding a granny flat for extra income. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the only spot to buy. There's not a one size fits all. It's very much a tailored solution that will fit your situation. Joe is asking, would commercial industrial metro soften with interest hikes? Yeah, good question. So look, as interest rates rise, the commercial property market often runs at different stages or cycles to the residential market. Commercial market is driven by business confidence, which is also driven by consumer demand. But we're finding that like industrial, if you're talking about like a warehouse, Joe, warehouses are literally going through the roof. The demand is phenomenal for logistics. So we're finding good industrial property is actually going to be in high demand. And as interest rates rises, we still think they're going to be in good demand. Amanda's asking, Rich, do you have a buyer's agent network across all states? Yes, we do. We have buyers all around Australia, and we have a huge referral network. So we can definitely help anyone buying right across Australia. John, I think this is one for you. How do the ATO know if you're a tax resident or not?
Interestingly, they have access to everybody's passport records. About a year ago, I was talking about a client and mentioning to the ATO that we needed to determine their various dates of residency and non-residency. And the helpful officer said, oh, well, would you like me to call that up for you now and let you know when they came and went? I'm going along and reading, you've got an investment income in Australia, but the cost associated leaves it at break even. So maybe it's minor positive, minor negative. You're below the tax-free threshold, but there's no tax-free threshold as a non-resident. You're not paying Australian tax on the property. You're earning Hong Kong income and paying tax in Hong Kong, but not declaring this in Australia. Am I doing it correctly? Well, no, you're not. Mm-hmm. So Australia's not interested in your Hong Kong income, but they are interested in your rental income and expenses. And if you are accruing a loss, well, you'll end up being able to, if you do return to Australia, or have a capital gain relative to that property at some stage down the track, use that loss to offset the capital gain. But nonetheless, if you're anybody, no matter whether you're an Australian citizen living overseas, anybody that owns property in Australia, you have to declare the rental income from that property.
Yep. Okay. Don't try and run the gauntlet is the summary, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Someone's asking, would a non-tax resident be exempt from capital gains tax for a primary residency asset if they become a tax resident again?
Partially, yes. So exempt. So an example there would be you purchase a main residence property in 2015. You move, let's make it 2018. You move overseas in 2018. You come back in 2023. You're an Australian resident. You then get to trigger the full main resident exemption because you haven't been away for 6 years. Let's just say you bought it in 2018, but you came back in 2028 and then sold it. Well, you'd only pay capital gains tax on, say, the 4 years after the 6 year exempt period. So you'll either get, if you sell the property again whilst you're a resident, you'll either get a full or a partial exemption, depending on the date that you acquired the property and the date that you ended up selling it.
Great. I've still got a few more questions back in. Oh, sorry, someone's asking me, Rich, is it a good idea to buy into off-the-plan property, say in Sydney at this juncture? My simple answer is be very, very careful with buying off the plan. Generally, I've bought off the plan and I've done well. I've bought off the plan and I've done poorly. So don't repeat my bad mistakes. I would say to you, it depends who the developer is. It depends what you're paying. Typically, just as a general, buying off the plan only works in a rising market because you've got a valuation risk. You know, you might decide to buy a beautiful 3-bedroom unit off the plan for $2 million. But come settlement time, suddenly the bank says, hey, that $2 million property is now worth 1.8, and you might have a $200,000 shortfall. And you've got to fund that out of your own pocket. The other issue with off the plan is just building standards. There are still some pretty average developers out there, and there's some really high quality developers. So it's knowing the quality of the developer and the quality of the development as well. So I would just proceed with extreme caution. Generally, I like to buy established property for all our clients, but For a lot of overseas buyers or foreign buyers, we have to buy brand new, but we can certainly guide you to who to use or who to buy from in that regard.
And just on that note as well, right? So a few of our clients coming through now from a few Melbourne properties that were bought off the plan, they're coming back at around 10 to 20% under at the moment. So it's actually quite significant given the big Melbourne run up a few years ago. So yeah, now basically what Rich said, the bank has come back with their valuation 20% under, and they'll only lend you 70 or 80% on the new valuation. So you have to come up with the difference.
That's a big drop. That's a big drop, man. Someone's asking, what about the reverse? Can I buy something overseas for retirement and rent it out as an offshore company? John.
Can I buy something overseas for retirement? Okay, so if you've purchased a property in anywhere, pick a country. If you've then purchased it in a company that is incorporated in that same company, in that same country, you then return to Australia, the greatest likelihood is that company will then be deemed an Australian tax resident. So it will pay tax in Australia at the then prevailing rate of tax.
Right.
But that's not a one size fits all, but that's a company residency is exceedingly complex. But typically if the controlling minds and owners are in Australia, it will be an Australian company for tax purposes.
Brilliant. Michael is asking, if an expat returns to Australia and moves into a, say, 10-year investment property as their PPR, principal place of residence, is the CGT then prorated?
Yeah, it is. So you can never trigger the full main residence exemption if you don't move into the property straight away. So if you move in after, say, 10 years, well, the amount of time that you then spend in it as your main residence, say you spend another 10 years in it and you sell it after 20 years, effectively you'll pay tax on half the gain that's then reduced by a further 50% only on the last 10 years. So the answer is yes, it is prorated.
Brendan is asking, what strategies do you use to purchase below market rates? That's a great question. So yeah, look, we use a number of strategies and we have a number of secret sources and strategies. I can't share them all online, otherwise I'd be giving away the farm. But it's all about, you know, how you approach the whole negotiation process, Brendan. You know, great question. Negotiation starts from the minute that you start conversing with an agent or make an inquiry. They're sizing you up as a potential buyer. Have you got the buying capacity? How many properties have you looked at? But we track properties and during the boom time, when it went to auction, you knew you had no control. It was going to be just whoever's got the deepest pockets. However, properties going to auction today is a great thing because we might only be one or two bidders. And we actually prefer to let properties run to auction now because we know we've got the upper hand. So it's just about doing a really detailed analysis and knowing what level of offer to go in at. But we're very, put your offers in writing. You might put a deadline on it. There's all different strategies like that that we use. Is there any update to the proposed legislation on tax residency, John?
Sadly, no. So it was announced in the May 2021 budget that the government was going to introduce legislation into the parliament to drastically change how tax residency is determined. They never even introduced draft legislation into the parliament before it was prorogued, just before the election. Whether Labor is going to have a crack at this is anybody's guess. I suspect that the first we'll hear about this is when Labor brings out its first budget, which I think is on the 22nd of October this year. I know it's in late October. So the answer at the moment is use the existing rules until it's legislated otherwise.
Eric's asking me for the names of a few good developers. Eric, probably best just to connect with me directly on email, and happy to have a chat about that. Ron's asking, does the capital gains tax obligation apply to non-resident expats living in the Middle East for more than 5 years on purchasing and selling the US shares?
That's a little bit outside my purview, but I guess if the question is, if you're living in the Middle East in a effectively a tax haven and you're purchasing shares relative to the US market whilst you're there, then selling them I don't believe there's any tax on that, but US tax, completely outside what I advise on. So is there any tax on that in the US? I don't know.
Right, right. Well, look, I think we might wrap it up there. Can I just say thank you for all our attendees for coming on today. Thank you, Martin, for sharing your really insightful knowledge on finance. John, your amazing knowledge on tax. And we really encourage you, if you do have further questions or would like to avail yourself to our services, please reach out and share us amongst your colleagues. We really appreciate your support for our businesses, and we'd love to help you on your property journey. So until next time, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Bye.